The village lay quiet under a heavy fog. The morning was cold and the streets were empty. Only the distant sound of birds broke the silence. But that peace would not last. A low, trembling rumble began to grow louder. At first it was like distant thunder. Then the villagers realized it was something far worse. A Tiger tank appeared on the main road. Its massive treads crushed everything under them. The metal body gleamed dimly through the fog, and its enormous gun swiveled slowly, scanning the surroundings. Smoke hissed from its engine as it moved forward, unstoppable. From the shadows, villagers peeked out from their hiding places. Old men clutched their hats. Children huddled close to their mothers. Everyone knew the stories of the Tiger tanks, the war machines that could destroy everything in their path. And now one of them was in their village. Among the frightened villagers stood a woman. She was in her early 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. Her name was Elena, and she had survived the worst of the war because of her cleverness and courage. While others panicked, she was thinking. Fast. The villagers whispered among themselves. "No one can stop that tank," said one man, his voice shaking. Another shook his head, muttering, "It's impossible. We are doomed." Elena's eyes followed the massive tank as it rolled forward. Her heart beat fast, but her hands were steady. She glanced around the street, checking for any useful objects, anything that could help. Most villagers had fled into the forests or hid inside their homes. But Elena stayed. She had an idea. Her hand reached for a simple object, a frying pan from her kitchen. It was old, dented, and not a weapon by any measure. Yet, in that moment, it felt like the only tool she had to challenge the impossible. She held it tightly, thinking of the plan forming in her mind. It was risky, so risky that most people would call it madness. But Elena had no choice. She crouched low behind a broken wall, her eyes never leaving the tank. The massive machine rumbled closer, and small pebbles under her feet threatened to give away her position. Sweat ran down her temple. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But Elena had something that the tank did not: intelligence, courage, and determination. The soldiers inside the Tiger tank were unaware of her. They were focused on the destruction around them, their eyes scanning for soldiers or resistance fighters. But no one would expect a lone woman with a frying pan to be their threat. Elena took a deep breath. She moved silently, one careful step at a time. Each move brought her closer to the tank, and yet each step could be her last. The ground shook with every rotation of the tank's treads. Dust and debris filled the air, and the smell of smoke and oil stung her nose. She swallowed hard and reminded herself to stay calm. The villagers watched from their hiding spots. They were afraid to hope. Could one woman really do something against a machine that had destroyed entire armies? They shook their heads in disbelief. But Elena's eyes told a different story. There was no fear in them now, only focus. The fog swirled around her, hiding her movements. She slipped through the alleys, moving like a shadow. The frying pan felt heavier in her hand than it ever had in the kitchen, but she did not let that stop her. Every noise made her freeze. A dog barked in the distance, and her heart skipped a beat. A sudden clatter of metal from the tank made her crouch lower, blending with the rubble. Elena's mind raced. She remembered the stories of the tank's weak points, the tracks, the engine, the wheels. She needed to get close, study it, and then act. But she also needed patience. One wrong move and it could all be over. One wrong step and she could be crushed or caught. Minutes passed like hours. The tank moved forward slowly, seemingly unstoppable. Elena followed at a careful distance, hidden by fog and shadow. She could hear the faint clink of metal on metal as the tank's treads rolled over stones. She could see the reflection of the morning light on its massive gun barrel. Her stomach churned with nervous energy. Suddenly she paused. The tank slowed slightly as it approached a narrow street. This was her chance. She adjusted her grip on the frying pan. Her fingers tightened around the handle. Her eyes narrowed, fixed on the target. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I can do this. I must." The camera, or the imagination of the audience, would focus on her face. Her eyes were wide, alert, calculating. Every second was a test. Would she survive? Could she succeed? The answer was uncertain, and that uncertainty filled the air with suspense. With a final glance at the villagers still hiding, Elena slipped into the fog, following the Tiger tank. She moved silently, one step at a time, the frying pan ready in her hand. The massive war machine roared ahead, unaware of the danger creeping closer. The battle had not yet begun, but the stage was set. One woman, one frying pan, and a Tiger tank that no one believed could be stopped. The fog hung thick over the village streets, making every shape look strange, every shadow seem alive. Elena kept her head low, slipping from alley to alley, always just out of sight of the Tiger tank. The machine moved slowly but powerfully, crushing the cobblestones under its massive treads. She could hear the metal wheels grinding, the engine hissing and clanking. Every sound made her pulse quicken, but she refused to panic. Elena crouched behind a crumbling wall and studied the tank. It was enormous, its steel armor shining dully in the pale morning light. Its cannon, long and menacing, could destroy anything in one shot. Soldiers inside scanned the streets, laughing and shouting commands. None of them noticed the small figure moving carefully in the fog. Her mind raced. How could one woman, armed only with a frying pan, stop such a monster? She remembered what old villagers had told her, tales of Tiger tanks being nearly unstoppable. The stories said the only weaknesses were the tracks, the engine, and the wheels. If she could reach those points, maybe, just maybe, she could slow it down. Elena peeked around the wall. The soldiers were busy directing civilians to move aside, their eyes focused on the chaos. The Tiger tank lurched forward, crushing barrels and crates. Smoke poured from its exhaust. It seemed unstoppable, a machine of death and destruction. She whispered to herself, "I have to do this. I have to stop it." Her hands tightened around the frying pan. It was not a weapon, but it could be used. Her plan formed slowly in her mind, step by step. First, she needed to study the tank closely, find its weak points. Then, she needed to create a distraction so the soldiers inside would not notice her. Finally, she had to damage the tank enough to stop it or at least slow it down. Moving carefully, Elena approached closer. Each step was measured, deliberate. One slip could mean discovery, or death. She crouched behind a pile of rubble, watching the tank's tracks. She noticed something. The treads had a small gap near the wheels, a place where a well-aimed object could jam the mechanism. Her heart raced. This was the chance she had been waiting for. But she had to be patient. She couldn't rush. The tank moved in fits and starts, turning slightly at intersections, crushing everything underfoot. Elena ducked as a soldier glanced in her direction. She froze, holding her breath until he looked away. Then she continued, careful to stay in the shadows. She paused behind a burned-out cart and considered the frying pan in her hands. It was heavy for her, but in the right way, it could be used to jam something small in the tank's machinery, create noise, or even serve as a distraction if thrown correctly. Every detail mattered. Every move had to be perfect. Time stretched. Elena crept closer, inch by inch, following the tank at a careful distance. She noticed that the soldiers inside were tense. Their laughter had faded. Perhaps they were aware of the villagers' fear, or maybe they sensed danger nearby. Elena smiled faintly to herself. The tank seemed unstoppable, but she had something it did not: imagination and courage. Suddenly, a metal barrel toppled nearby with a loud crash. Elena froze, pressed against the wall. A soldier turned sharply, scanning the street. She held her breath, her body rigid. The tank slowed slightly, the soldier shouting at his comrades. Minutes passed like hours. The soldier relaxed, moving away. Elena exhaled slowly and pressed on, closer to the monster. Her eyes scanned every inch of the tank. She noticed small openings near the engine, places where sparks could fly if something hit just right. A loose piece of metal here, a strike there, and maybe she could create enough chaos to halt the tank. Her plan was risky, almost impossible. Yet she felt a strange calm. This was her chance to do something no one else could. Elena moved behind a stack of crates. The tank was now directly ahead. She could see the soldiers' faces through the viewing slits. They were confident, careless. This was her advantage. She whispered softly, "One step at a time. Don't rush." Her eyes flicked between the engine, the treads, and the frying pan. She studied the movement of the tank like a chess master watching the opponent. She also thought of the villagers. They were hiding, afraid, unable to do anything. She was their only hope, and that thought strengthened her resolve. She had trained herself to think quickly, to act faster than anyone expected. And now, everything she had learned would be put to the test. The tank slowed at the narrow street ahead. Elena's heartbeat thumped in her ears. The time was coming. She adjusted the grip on the frying pan. It was not just a piece of kitchenware anymore. It was a tool of survival, a symbol of defiance against the impossible. She crept forward, careful not to make a sound. The fog wrapped around her, hiding her from view. Every step was dangerous. Every second could be her last. Yet, despite the danger, there was determination in her eyes. She was ready. The plan was simple in theory but deadly in practice. Create a distraction, reach the engine or tracks, and damage them enough to stop the tank. It sounded impossible. But Elena had never been one to back down from the impossible. She whispered again, "I can do this. I must do this." The villagers watched silently from their hiding spots, hearts in their mouths. They dared not hope, yet they couldn't stop themselves from noticing her courage. The tank was massive, the soldiers confident, and the odds against her overwhelming. But Elena moved with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. And with that, she began her silent approach, each step bringing her closer to the tiger tank, closer to danger, and closer to the impossible. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to the broken walls and narrow alleys of the village. Elena moved carefully, her body low, eyes fixed on the massive tiger tank ahead. Each step made a soft crunch on the gravel, a sound that could betray her. She froze, heart pounding, as the tank's engine groaned and the soldiers inside shouted orders. Every command, every noise, every echo of metal on stone made her pulse race faster. Elena hugged the side of a crumbling wall, peeking around just enough to watch the soldiers. They laughed, confident and careless, unaware of the danger creeping closer with each second. She noted their positions carefully, memorizing the gaps in their attention. This was her chance to get closer, but she could not afford a mistake. One slip and it would all be over. She spotted a narrow opening near the back of the tank, a small alley between two ruined buildings. If she could reach it, she would be closer to the tracks, closer to the engine, and closer to the weak points she had been studying. Elena adjusted the grip on her frying pan, feeling its weight in her hand. Not a weapon but a tool. A symbol. A lifeline. Her stomach churned as she took her first step toward the alley. The ground beneath her was uneven, littered with broken bricks and shattered wood. One wrong step and she could make a noise loud enough for the soldiers to hear. Her breath was slow, careful. She moved as silently as she could, every movement calculated. Suddenly, a soldier stepped toward the alley, his boots clanging against the stone. Elena froze instantly, pressing herself flat against the wall. The soldier looked around, suspicious, his eyes scanning the shadows. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Elena held her breath so tightly that her chest ached. Seconds stretched like hours. Finally, the soldier shrugged and walked away, muttering to his comrades. Elena exhaled slowly, relief washing over her for a brief moment. But she knew there was no time to celebrate. She moved again, inching closer to the tiger tank. The treads were now almost within reach, each one massive and threatening. The engine hissed and clanked, smoke curling into the fog. The soldiers were shouting now, pointing at the villagers in the distance, distracted by the chaos. This was her opening. She crouched behind a pile of rubble, peering at the tank. The metal was cold and unyielding, but she could see small gaps in the tracks. If she could wedge something in, maybe jam it, the tank would slow. Maybe even stop. Her heart pounded with the thought, but she dared not hesitate. Every second wasted could be her last. Elena took a deep breath and moved closer, careful to avoid stepping on loose debris. She had almost reached the opening when a loud clang echoed nearby. Another piece of rubble had shifted under her foot. Her heart jumped into her throat. The soldiers turned sharply, scanning the shadows. One of them aimed his rifle in her direction. Time seemed to slow. Elena pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. The soldier's finger hovered over the trigger. Her mind raced. She could not move. She could not make a sound. The frying pan in her hand felt heavier than ever, as if it carried all the weight of her life. Then a gust of wind blew through the alley, scattering loose papers and dust. The soldier blinked, confused, and lowered his rifle. Elena's pulse raced, but she allowed herself a tiny movement. Slowly, carefully, she shifted behind the rubble, closer to the opening. She paused again, watching the tank. Smoke hissed from the engine, and a small flame flickered near the exhaust. The soldiers were still focused on the villagers, arguing and shouting. This was her moment. She needed to act. But she was not ready yet. She needed to wait for the perfect chance to strike, to use her frying pan in a way that no one would expect. The tension was unbearable. Each second felt like a lifetime. Elena's hands were clammy, her fingers gripping the frying pan until her knuckles turned white. She could feel the vibration of the tank through the ground. She could hear the clatter of metal and the shouting of men. Every sound threatened to give her away. Suddenly, one of the soldiers near the rear of the tank turned toward the alley again. Elena froze. She pressed herself flat against the wall, holding her breath so tightly that her lungs ached. The soldier paused, scanning the fog. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. Then, unexpectedly, the soldier moved away again, distracted by a falling crate on the other side. Elena exhaled slowly, a small smile of relief forming on her lips. She had survived the first real danger. But she knew this was only the beginning. The tank was still ahead, massive, menacing, and nearly unstoppable. And she was still only one woman, armed with a frying pan, facing what seemed impossible. She adjusted her grip, wiped sweat from her brow, and prepared for the next step. Every nerve in her body was alert. Every instinct screamed that danger was near. And yet, there was determination in her eyes. She would not fail. She could not fail. The villagers were counting on her. The Tiger tank would not leave this village untouched, not if she could help it. With a deep breath, Elena pressed on, moving silently through the fog, closer to the tank, closer to danger, and closer to the impossible task she had set for herself. The first real test had passed. The next would be even harder. The Tiger tank had slowed slightly, moving awkwardly through the narrow streets of the village. Its massive treads crushed stones and debris underfoot, leaving a trail of destruction behind. Smoke hissed from its engine, curling into the fog like a dark cloud. Soldiers shouted at each other, pointing at villagers who were desperately trying to stay hidden. But all of them missed the one figure moving silently, carefully, closer to the heart of the machine. Elena crouched behind a pile of rubble, her breathing steady but her pulse racing. She had never been this close to a Tiger tank before, and the reality of it was terrifying. Its sheer size, its noise, and the soldiers inside made it feel like an unstoppable force. And yet, she reminded herself, every machine had a weakness. Every beast could be tamed with cleverness and courage. She adjusted the grip on her frying pan. It was not a weapon in the normal sense, but she could use it in ways the soldiers would never expect. Her plan had been carefully formed in her mind over the past tense minutes. Create a distraction, get near the tracks, jam the wheels or damage the engine, and slow the tank down. Simple in theory, deadly in practice. Elena peeked around the rubble. The soldiers were busy directing each other, their attention drawn to a barrel that had toppled nearby. Smoke from the engine made the air thick, and the fog helped conceal her movements. Step by step she edged closer. Every foot forward brought her nearer to the Tiger's Achilles heel. Then a sound made her freeze, a faint clink of metal beneath the tank. She held her breath, heart pounding. One of the soldiers had glanced toward her direction. Time seemed to slow. Elena pressed herself against the wall, invisible in the shadows. The soldier muttered something and walked away. Her muscles relaxed just slightly. She was still alive. For now. Carefully, Elena slipped closer to the side of the tank. The treads were massive, each link heavy enough to crush a person instantly. But she noticed a small gap in the mechanism near the rear wheel, a space just wide enough to wedge something in. Her eyes sparkled with determination. This was it, the first real step. She crouched low, placing the frying pan on the ground for a moment to steady herself. She grabbed a small rock from the rubble and positioned it near the gap. The plan was risky. One wrong move and the tank could crush her, or a soldier could spot her and shoot. Sweat ran down her forehead, but she did not flinch. Her hands moved carefully, methodically, like a surgeon operating under pressure. Suddenly, a soldier stepped closer, aiming his rifle toward the rubble. Elena froze, heart racing. The frying pan was her only shield and tool, yet it felt fragile in her hands. She held still, hoping the soldier's attention would shift. The tank groaned and shifted, and smoke hissed from the engine. The noise hid her tiny movements. Slowly, ever so slowly, she placed the rock into the gap. A small clatter echoed. Her heart jumped. The soldier turned sharply, eyes scanning the fog. Elena pressed herself flat against the ground, willing herself to disappear. Seconds passed like hours. Finally, the soldier looked away, muttering under his breath. Elena exhaled, tiny but triumphant. The first part of her plan had worked. The tank lurched slightly. Smoke rose in thicker clouds. Elena's eyes widened with cautious hope. It wasn't much yet, but the machine had begun to falter. She adjusted her grip on the frying pan and took another careful step toward the engine. The soldiers were still distracted, focused on shouting orders. She had bought herself precious minutes. She knew the second step would be harder. The engine was hot, dangerous, and nearly impossible to reach without being seen. Yet she was determined. Every step brought her closer, and every step was a battle against fear. She crouched behind a discarded crate and measured the distance to the engine compartment. Her frying pan felt heavier than ever, as if carrying all the weight of her mission. Elena moved again, inching toward the engine. Smoke burned her eyes, and the heat radiating from the tank was intense. The soldiers inside shouted at each other, unaware of the danger approaching them from the shadows. Step by step, she got closer, slipping past the wheels, the treads, and the metal armor that seemed impenetrable. Finally, she reached the spot she had been aiming for. The engine compartment was just within reach. She lifted the frying pan, using it to wedge a small piece of debris into the machinery. Sparks flew, and the engine groaned louder, smoke puffing out in dark clouds. The tank shuddered violently, slowing even more. Elena's heart leapt. The first strike had succeeded. The soldiers shouted, alarmed by the sudden grinding and hissing of the engine. They ran to check the machine, their confidence faltering. Elena pressed herself flat against the metal, hiding in the shadows. She had achieved the first goal. The Tiger tank had been slowed. But the danger was far from over. Her legs trembled slightly, her hands sweaty, but determination burned in her eyes. One woman, armed only with a frying pan, had managed the impossible, at least partially. The first strike was a warning to the machine, a challenge to the soldiers, and a signal to the villagers. Someone was brave enough to fight back. Elena took a moment to catch her breath, eyes never leaving the tank. Smoke filled the air, and the soldiers inside were shouting, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The Tiger tank was massive, dangerous, and far from defeated. She had to act again, carefully, cleverly, and without hesitation. Step by step, she prepared herself for the next move. Every second was crucial. Every decision could be life or death. She had slowed the monster, but the battle was far from over. And Elena, with nothing but a frying pan and her courage, was ready for the challenge. The Tiger tank groaned and shuddered as smoke hissed from its damaged engine. Elena pressed herself flat against the rubble, chest heaving, frying pan still clutched tightly in her hands. Her first strike had worked, the tank had slowed. But she knew the soldiers would not ignore this for long. Every second she stayed near the machine was a risk. One careless move and she could be crushed or shot. Suddenly, one of the soldiers spotted movement near the alley. He shouted sharply, alerting the others. "Something's there," he barked. The Tiger tank lurched slightly as the crew inside realized that something had gone wrong. Elena froze, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had feared. The enemy was reacting, and she was right in the middle of danger. She ducked behind a crumbling wall, trying to make herself invisible. The soldiers scanned the foggy street, rifles aimed and eyes sharp. Their boots clanged on the cobblestones as they approached her hiding spot. Elena's breath came in quiet, controlled gasps. Every second counted. She needed a plan, and fast. A soldier's boot struck a loose brick, sending a loud clatter echoing through the alley. Elena's stomach twisted. She knew they were getting closer. She pressed the frying pan against the wall beside her, thinking quickly. It wasn't just a shield, it could be a tool, a distraction. Carefully she tossed it across the street. The pan hit a pile of broken crates with a loud clang, and the soldiers turned sharply toward the noise. It worked. For a moment, the attention of the soldiers shifted away from her. She exhaled slowly and crept to a better position, closer to the rear of the tank. The engine hissed and sputtered, smoke curling thickly into the fog. The tank had slowed even more, struggling to move. Elena knew that the first strike had rattled the crew. Now she had a small window to act again. But the enemy was not done. Another soldier noticed the smoking engine and ran toward it, shouting at his comrades. The Tiger tank groaned as if alive, its massive treads grinding against the stones. Elena hugged the wall, every muscle tense, listening to the clattering boots and shouting voices. The danger was real and it was closing in fast. Elena's mind raced. She had to stay calm. One wrong move and the tank would crush her. One careless sound and the soldiers would shoot. But she had an idea. She grabbed a loose stone from the rubble and held it in her hand, next to the frying pan. She could use it to jam the tracks further or distract the soldiers again. It was risky, but it might give her the edge she needed. The soldiers reached the rear of the tank, rifles raised. They shouted at each other, trying to find the source of the damage. Elena moved carefully, inching closer to the tracks. She noticed a small gap near the engine compartment, perfect for a wedge or obstruction. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. Courage outweighed fear. Just as she was about to place the stone, a soldier turned toward her direction. Elena froze, pressing herself flat against the ground. His eyes scanned the rubble, looking for any sign of movement. Time slowed. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears. The soldier lifted his rifle. She was inches from discovery. Then a crate fell somewhere behind him with a loud crash. The soldier flinched and looked away. Elena exhaled quietly and moved her hand, carefully placing the stone near the gap in the tracks. Sparks flew as it shifted slightly under the tank's weight. The Tiger tank groaned, treads grinding against the obstruction. The machine lurched again, smoke billowing from the engine. The soldiers shouted in alarm. "It's stuck," one of them yelled. "Check the tracks." Another ran forward, trying to free the machinery. Elena pressed herself against the wall, hiding in the shadows. Her first strike had slowed the tank, but this second interference was creating chaos. She could see fear creeping into the soldiers' faces. They were no longer confident. But she knew it would not last long. The soldiers were trained and the tank was massive. They could regroup. She needed to move again quickly. The frying pan felt heavier than ever in her hands, but it was her only tool. Every sound of metal, every shout, every clatter reminded her that the enemy could reach her at any moment. Elena crept forward, slipping behind the tank, careful to stay in the fog and shadows. The soldiers were distracted, trying to free the tracks and repair the engine. Smoke and steam filled the air, creating a dangerous, chaotic scene. This was her chance, the perfect moment to strike again. Her mind was focused. She had slowed the monster, created confusion, and forced the enemy to react. But she was not done. The Tiger tank was still alive, still dangerous. And the soldiers, though shaken, were determined. Elena knew the next step would be even riskier. One wrong move and she could be caught. She adjusted her grip on the frying pan and whispered to herself, barely audible, "Almost there. Just a little further." The fog swirled around her, hiding her from view. She was moving closer to the heart of the tank, closer to the engine, closer to victory. Every nerve in her body was alert. Every instinct screamed at her to stay alive. The enemy was attacking, but Elena was ready. She had slowed the tank, confused the soldiers, and survived their search. Now it was time for the final moves, dangerous, daring, and impossible to predict. One woman, armed with only a frying pan, was challenging the greatest war machine of the age. The fog had grown thicker now, curling around broken walls and ruined buildings. Smoke from the Tiger tank's damaged engine filled the air, mixing with the dust and debris of the narrow village streets. Elena pressed herself against a crumbling wall, her eyes fixed on the massive machine. Every instinct told her this was the most dangerous moment. The soldiers had regained some composure, shouting orders and scanning the area. But she had come too far to turn back now. The tank groaned and shuddered, its treads grinding slowly over the cobblestones. Sparks flew where the stone and debris Elena had placed were caught in the tracks. She could see the soldiers' panic growing. Their confidence was fading. Their machine was faltering. Yet, Elena knew the hardest part was still ahead. One wrong move now and everything could be lost. She adjusted her grip on the frying pan. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but it had become her shield, her tool, her lifeline. She glanced at the narrow gap near the engine compartment. This was the tank's heart, the place that powered its monstrous strength. If she could damage or jam it completely, the Tiger tank would stop. But getting there meant exposing herself, moving closer to the soldiers and the roaring machine than ever before. Elena waited for the right moment. Patience had been her ally throughout this mission, and it would be her ally now. The soldiers were distracted, arguing about the stalled treads and smoke rising from the engine. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the pan. Every step from here would be deliberate, precise, deadly if miscalculated. She slipped forward, crouching low, her feet silent against the rubble-strewn ground. The fog wrapped around her like a cloak, hiding her movements. The tank loomed over her, its massive gun pointing in another direction. Sparks flew from the track, smoke hissed from the engine, and the deafening sound of metal grinding filled the air. Elena's heart raced, but her mind was calm. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She reached the side of the tank, inches from the engine compartment. The heat radiated from the metal, intense enough to burn if she touched it. But she did not hesitate. She placed a small wedge of debris, carefully positioned, into the machinery near the engine. Then, using the frying pan, she struck another piece of metal, creating a spark and jamming the engine further. The Tiger tank shuddered violently, groaning as if alive. Smoke erupted from multiple points, curling thickly into the fog. The treads ground against the cobblestones, straining, then began to slow dramatically. The soldiers inside shouted in panic, banging on the controls, trying to get the engine to respond. But it was too late. Elena had targeted the heart of the machine. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The massive tank lurched, tilted slightly to one side, then came to a complete stop. Silence fell over the street, broken only by the hissing of steam and smoke from the damaged engine. The soldiers froze, staring in disbelief. They had underestimated her, a single woman armed only with a frying pan, and now their war machine was helpless. Elena pressed herself flat against the wall, sweat streaming down her face. Her hands shook slightly from the adrenaline, but her eyes were steady, focused. She had done the impossible. The Tiger tank, the unstoppable war machine that had terrified her village, had been stopped by a single person. One woman. One frying pan. The soldiers climbed out of the tank, their confidence shattered. They shouted and argued, but no one dared approach Elena. The machine that had inspired fear for miles around was now immobile, a symbol of their failure. Elena watched quietly, hiding in the fog, heart still pounding. She knew she was not completely safe yet. The soldiers could regroup, but the immediate danger had passed. Slowly she moved back from the engine, keeping low. The fog hid her from view as she retreated to a safer distance. The villagers who had been hiding began to emerge cautiously, their eyes wide in amazement. They whispered to each other, pointing at the disabled tank and then at her figure in the mist. No one could believe it. A single woman, armed with nothing but courage and a frying pan, had stopped a Tiger tank. Elena allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Her hands were blackened with dirt and soot, her clothes torn and stained, but she had survived. She had accomplished what no one else could. The tank sat silent, a defeated giant, while the villagers began to cheer quietly, in awe of her bravery. Yet Elena did not celebrate. She knew the war was not over. Danger still lurked and her village was far from safe. But for this moment, the impossible had been achieved. One woman had faced a machine that seemed unstoppable and had won, not with weapons or armies but with courage, intelligence, and sheer determination. As the fog swirled around her, Elena held the frying pan in her hands, looking at the immobile Tiger tank. It was more than just a tool now, it was a symbol of her defiance, her bravery, and her victory against the impossible. The first strike had slowed the machine, the second had created chaos, and the final move had stopped it completely. The villagers approached slowly, whispers of admiration in their voices. Elena stood tall, breathing heavily but proud. The Tiger tank, the symbol of fear and destruction, had been defeated by someone they had underestimated. And in that moment, they realized that courage, ingenuity, and determination could conquer even the greatest of machines. Elena looked at the frying pan in her hands and whispered to herself, "It's over, for now." The battle had been won and a legend had been born. One woman, one frying pan, and a Tiger tank destroyed. The fog slowly began to lift as morning light pierced the shattered streets of the village. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the lingering roar of the Tiger tank that had once seemed unstoppable. But now, the massive machine sat immobile, steam hissing from its engine, treads frozen in defeat. Silence stretched across the village, broken only by the quiet whispers of the villagers emerging from their hiding places. Elena stood a few meters away from the tank, her body tense but her spirit unbroken. Dirt and soot smeared her face, and her clothes were torn and stained, but her eyes shone with triumph. She still clutched the frying pan, her unlikely weapon, now a symbol of her courage. The impossible had been done. She had faced a war machine that had terrified an entire village, and she had stopped it. Slowly, villagers began to step out of their hiding places, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Children peeked from behind doorways, their eyes wide in disbelief. Elderly men and women emerged, shaking their heads, whispering to each other. She stopped it," one old man said, voice trembling. How did one woman do this?" A few villagers approached Elena carefully, their faces a mixture of awe and gratitude. They could not fully comprehend what they had witnessed. The Tiger tank, a symbol of destruction and fear, had been defeated not by soldiers or explosives, but by the bravery and cleverness of a single woman. Elena looked at them quietly, nodding slightly, acknowledging their presence but remaining focused. The soldiers who had been inside the tank were retreating. Some ran to regroup, their faces pale and fearful. They had underestimated her. They had assumed she was just another frightened villager. And now they had learned a lesson they would never forget. The machine that had crushed everything in its path was stopped. And the person responsible was not a trained soldier or a general. It was Elena, armed only with a frying pan and her courage. The villagers began to gather around the tank, whispering and pointing at Elena. Some approached slowly, bringing her water or cloths to wipe the soot from her face. She accepted silently, letting them tend to her, but her mind was still racing. The danger had not completely passed. The war was far from over. Yet, for this moment, victory belonged to her, and to the village she had saved. Elena took a deep breath, looking at the massive tank one last time. Every dent, every scratch, every puff of smoke told a story of the impossible battle she had fought. One strike, one distraction, one clever move had been enough to halt the monster. And yet, she knew that her success had relied not just on courage, but on careful observation, patience, and thinking faster than anyone else. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices full of admiration and disbelief. "She is our hero," one woman said quietly. "She has done what no one else could." Children looked at her with wide eyes, imagining the bravery it must have taken to stand before such a machine. For them, Elena was no longer just a neighbor, she was a legend, a story they would tell for generations. Elena lowered the frying pan, her arms tired but steady. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. The tank was stopped, the villagers were safe, and she had proven that courage and intelligence could conquer even the greatest machines. The soldiers, realizing they could do nothing, retreated further, leaving the street quiet once more. She turned to the villagers and for the first time, allowed herself a small, proud smile. They cheered quietly, not loudly, but with hearts full of gratitude. The legend of what had happened this morning would spread quickly. One woman, one frying pan, and a tiger tank destroyed. It was a story that no one would forget, a story of courage that proved even the impossible could be achieved. The fog began to lift completely now, revealing the village in the soft light of morning. Broken crates, smashed barrels, and stones littered the streets, but the people were alive. Elena walked slowly through the village, acknowledging the nods and whispers of thanks. Her heart swelled with quiet pride, but she remained humble. She knew that this victory, though incredible, was just one small part of a larger war. Finally, she stopped near the tank and placed her hand lightly on the cold metal. "We did it," she whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else. The frying pan in her other hand gleamed in the morning light, a simple tool, transformed into a symbol of bravery, determination, and hope. As the villagers gathered around, the story began to spread, carried in whispers and looks of awe. One woman had stood against the greatest war machine of the age. One woman had shown that courage, intelligence, and quick thinking could overcome even the deadliest odds. And though the war continued beyond their village, for this moment, hope had returned. Elena took a deep breath and stepped back from the tank. She knew that her actions would be remembered, not just in her village, but as a story to inspire others. One woman, one frying pan, and a tiger tank destroyed. A small act of bravery had changed everything, and the legend of that day would live forever.